Welcome to the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. The live stream session will start shortly. Before we begin, we want to remind you of some housekeeping. You will stay muted throughout the live session, so we can't hear you. The session is scheduled to be either 1 or 1.5 hours long, including questions. To ask the speakers a question, use the stage chat found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do not ask questions for the live session in the main events chat. This session will be recorded and will be available to watch again on the AHDB Potatoes YouTube channel and the AHDB website. At the end of the session, we will provide you with a unique Basis and Noroso code, which you should keep note of for each session that you attend. Don't forget to apply for points using the Basis and Noroso application forms, which can be found in the reception area. Join the conversation online by following AHDB Potatoes on Twitter and use the hashtag SpotFarmResults2020. Finally, if you have any issues with the conference platform, contact the team on events@ahdb.org.uk. We hope that you enjoy the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. Your session will now start.
With the loss of Vidate that we heard about at the end of December, AHDB acted quickly to submit applications for emergency approval. But nematicides mainly preserve yield in the current season. They don't do much to knock down populations in the soil. To do that, the main method is use of resistant varieties. But these aren't possible for everybody. And in that situation, one alternative is to employ trap crops, which deceive the nematode into hatching and then thankfully dying. We have two speakers today with real in-depth experience of the use of trap crops. James Lee is the business manager of Produce Solutions, which sells the seeds of two types of trap crops and has years of knowledge of the experiences, good and bad, of those who've bought the seeds. Ivan Grove is a former member of staff at Harper Adams University and now an independent researcher, and he's been conducting trials last season. I look forward to what they both have to say. Thank you.
So good afternoon. Thanks, Anne. My name's James Lee, and I'm the Business Manager for Produce Solutions, as Anne says, the Agronomy and Trials Unit within Greenville AP. I'd like to thank Anne and the team at AHDB for inviting me to spend a few minutes talking about my experiences of trap cropping for PCN control in potatoes. I often inwardly groan when I see yet another slide in a PCN presentation showing the life cycle. But I think it's important here just to indicate where in the cycle trap cropping works and why it results in a reduction in egg number. In essence, we're simply looking to establish a crop that stimulates PCN egg hatch. However, the trap crop plant doesn't allow the female larvae to form new cysts. Consequently, the larvae die, and the result is a significant reduction in the PCN eggs before the next potato crop. It's important to say trap cropping is not a new concept. When I joined Greenville 20 years ago, there was work being undertaken looking at planting potato crops for this purpose, letting them establish for a few weeks to allow PCN eggs to hatch, and then harvesting the hormone roots, removing them from the field, and therefore attempting to break the life cycle by removing these roots and stolons before the hatched larvae were able to form new cysts. This was obviously a risky concept, and if the crop weren't harvested at the right time, then the PCN numbers would dramatically increase rather than decrease. Consequently, this was never developed into a commercial management tool. Instead, the research emphasis was on looking for other solanaceous plants that stimulated egg hatch but wouldn't allow any multiplication. In the late 90s, a Sapio Link project was looking at integrated pest management of PCN, and one of the areas was trap cropping. Out of this project, a number of potential Solanum species were identified as having suitable characteristics. Greenvale and Branston both launched commercial trap crop products, with Greenvale's being called Decist and the species being Solanum cicimbrifolium. Decist has been commercially available since 2004 and has been grown successfully ever since. The crop has the potential to reduce PCN populations by 75%, and a 95% reduction in number is the best we have seen. There hasn't been a massive increase in the area treated until relatively recently, and there are a number of reasons for this. I'll touch on the agronomic considerations. However, the main two challenges have been seed supply and rotational space. Cicimbrifolium is not a native species to the UK, and as such, our climate is not ideal. It ideally requires soil temperatures of 15 degrees C and higher in order to germinate and establish. Seed production is not possible in the UK and currently takes place in China. The seed crops are harvested by hand, and given the nature of the long and sharp spikes the plant produces, is a considerable challenge in itself. The other aspect of seed production that has sometimes impacted on availability is the presence of a number of notifiable diseases in China that would prevent the import of seed should the crop become infected. This has happened on a number of occasions and has resulted in us moving our production area within China to less disease-prone areas. In the development of our trap crop offer, we have been looking for further Solanum species that might better suit our climate and growing systems, and in 2018 we launched Decist broadleaf, Solanum scabrum. This is a plant that is grown in Africa, and whilst it would appear to have similar, if not better, activity on PCN than Decist, it also has some agronomic characteristics that potentially make it more favourable. Seed supply is far easier, as the crop has no thorns, and less risk of disease. We have seen quicker establishment, and the canopy is often large, vigorous, and quite competitive. The basic agronomics of the crop are broadly similar to Solanum cicimbrifolium. Both trap crops are supplied in 20 kilo bags, sufficient to establish 1 hectare. The seed is very small and mixed with inert lentils to allow drilling through a conventional seed drill. Soil temperature is key to good germination and establishment, and as such, we recommend drilling from mid-May onwards when the soil temperatures are 15 degrees C and rising. Drilling depth is also critical, and Ivan is also going to discuss this in his presentation on late establishment opportunities. We recommend that drilling is as shallow as possible, certainly with Decist, and that the seedbed is well consolidated afterwards by rolling if possible. Soil to seed contact needs to be good. We have found the population of plants required for good PCN hatch is actually relatively small. And if we can achieve more than 40 plants per square metre, then we should see very good reduction in numbers. The crops require a small amount of nitrogen to establish, and we recommend about 50 kilos a hectare. If the seedbed is dry following drilling, then we also recommend irrigation until germination has occurred. Weed control can be challenging, and for that reason, we recommend drilling into a prepared stale seedbed. Where we see good and rapid germination and establishment, the two crops can be quite competitive. There are a few post-M and pre-M herbicide options, including rimsulfuron and bentazone, and we do have a set of agronomy guidelines which we are currently updating. Here are 2 examples of commercial trap crops. Decist has been widely used in Jersey for many years and complements their rotations very well. They can establish a trap crop following harvest of the potato crop when the climate is ideal. This Decist broadleaf crop was grown in Pembrokeshire in 2018. It was drilled into a stale seedbed and received no further weed control. It wasn't irrigated, but the field did receive rainfall a few days after drilling. Trap crops have been demonstrated at some of the spot farms in recent years, and this chart shows the reduction in PCN eggs from a small plot trial run by VCS for AHDB at Spot Farm East in 2018. Here we saw an average of 75% reduction in egg numbers for both Decist and broadleaf. We set up a trial in 2 commercially grown crops of Decyst and Decyst broadleaf in Shropshire in 2019. And the trial was actually very useful in demonstrating some of the challenges we see in the establishment of trap crops. The fields were drilled in late May. The intention was to drill into a stale seedbed, however, this wasn't possible. Sod's Law came into play and both fields were incredibly weedy, with fat N and groundsel being the predominant weeds. You can clearly see from the photos how weedy patches of the field were. The seed was also planted a little too deep and establishment was relatively poor. Typically, we were seeing areas with considerably fewer than 20 plants per square metre. We recorded initial egg counts in 9 locations in each field, and at the end of September, we resampled the exact same areas to identify the final PCN egg counts. The establishment and weed competition was such that for some of the final samples, there were only 1 or 2 trap crop plants within the zone of sampling, and we weren't expecting to see any great impact from the trap crops. When we did receive the results back, we were pleasantly surprised, and the broadleaf in particular, despite the poor establishment, had reduced the egg count by an average of 68% across the 9 locations. One of the reasons we feel the results were better than we expected was due to the soil moisture throughout the season. We spoke with Andy Barker about the results, and his observations were that even though the plant population was low, the exudates from the roots of the trap crop had been able to travel a relatively long distance through the soil, resulting in a wider sphere of influence. Therefore, while this particular trial demonstrated some of the challenges involved, it did reinforce to us how effective these trap crops can be when good establishment is achieved. One of the specific areas that the trial demonstrated well was the need for shallow drilling and good consolidation. This photo shows one of the headlands of the commercial crop where the drill had struggled to achieve any depth of drilling as the headland was quite compacted when the crop was drilled. Here we saw a very good establishment from the broadleaf when the seed had been barely covered by soil and had then subsequently been rolled. In summary, there are a few important considerations that need to be taken when growing a trap crop. Firstly, we need to remember it is a crop. It needs to be looked after rather than sown and forgotten about. Seed availability has been a challenge in the past, but we are confident this will be less of an issue in the future. Soil temperature, drilling depth, and seedbed consolidation are important considerations. When considering weed control options, we do recommend a stale seedbed is created whenever possible. Also, just a reminder that trap crops have no activity on free-living nematodes, but they appear to be equally as effective with both species of PCN. And finally, because of some of the considerations above, finding a window in existing rotations has been challenging. But Ivan will talk to you about a trial last year looking at opportunity for late establishment of trap crops with a view to growing them in between winter and spring crops in existing rotations. When considering the benefits of trap crops, the main one has to be the level of efficacy we see when a good crop is established. Very significant reductions in egg counts have been seen. They can be grown any year in the rotation. However, we would recommend a gap of at least 3 months following a potato crop to allow the cysts to mature. A crop only needs to have been established for 8 to 12 weeks to be effective. They don't need to be in the ground for any longer than this. No specialist equipment is required, other than the standard equipment that's already present on most farms. Trap crops can also produce a considerable amount of top growth, and in themselves also have a use as a green manure. And finally, as I've just mentioned, Ivan is going to address now the opportunities for late summer establishment of trap crops, which would greatly improve the ability of growers to find a suitable place in their rotation to use them. Thank you.
Right, good morning everyone. My name is Ivan Grove. I'm an independent advisor. As Anne quite happily said, I used to be a principal lecturer at Harper Adams and did quite a lot of research in the nematology group over many, many years. My role this time is actually an advisor and a manager, if you like, of the Shropshire Growers Discussion Group trials that were launched under the Innovative Farmers, which is a set of partnership programs managed by the Soil Association to encourage farming groups to do their own research where they see potential to improve farm practices. So, since 2012, they've actually had over 100 farmer-led projects launched across the UK, and they're multi-sector within agriculture itself. So they can be pretty much anything that you're interested in if it's related to agriculture. I would suggest you can have a look at their website just to see some of the really innovative projects that are going in, that are being launched, which other people have got involved with. And it gives people a way to actually look at things on their farm with a little bit of help from other research institutions and advisors and other agronomists. So the ideas developed by the farmers, they come together in what's classified as a group, and then they host the research and the trials on their own holdings, which means that the actual results are of a real benefit to them. You have to apply for the funding, and that is then considered by the Soil Association Innovative Farmers Group. And if you're successful, then they actually select some coordinators, some research partners, so that, you know, as farmers, you have you can do your job really well, but you may need a little bit of help to actually get the organisation going and look and design the experiments so that they mean something to you and to other people. So my role was in the Shropshire Growers Discussion Group, which has been probably around for quite a number of years now, and it was something that was launched at Harper Adams with Matthew Back and originally with Pat Haydock as well. So our project, well, basically, as James has already told us, PCN and minute worm-like organisms that survive in the soil within cysts. And the big problem, or one of their big problems, is they can survive for well over 20 years between host crops. So they can just sit in the soil and wait for you to plant another crop of potatoes 20, 25 years from now. And that is a big issue. And although the population declines over that time, it does actually create a problem. I mean, who wants to have a 25-year rotation? Yeah. PCN are present in 48% of all samples taken from potato growing land. That was done by DeBal in 2019, which showed a slight decrease from the work of Minnis back in 2000. But we've still got over half of the potato growing land is actually, or the ware growing land is actually infested with this pest. Two species, Pallida and Rostockiensis. And anybody who's familiar with this pest will know that G. pallida is the significantly difficult one to kill. Potatoes are the only field-grown host in the UK. Yes, there are weeds that will stimulate their growth, but we don't intend to grow them as a crop, and we certainly don't really want the weeds there in the first place. That planting stimulates the hatch. So the minute you put that potato in the ground, it starts growing. We've actually seen hatch starting to occur within a week or so. Once those roots start getting pushed out into the ground, then they will start stimulating it. So they invade into the roots, reduce water and nutrient uptake, and substantially reduce the yields, depending on the populations in the soil. Obviously, we all know, or anyone that have any issues with PCN, they know that it's such a significant cost. £300 a hectare for nematicides, £600 when it used to be for things like metam sodium. So you could be looking easily at £1,000 just for a control per hectare, just for this one pest. Historically, we used to use a lot of nematicides. The loss of validate has done us no favours whatsoever in some respects. But this work on trap cropping has been going on for many years. As James said, resistant cultivars are an ideal way forward, and they've actually almost got rid of the Rostockiensis PCN, but we do not have that option with Pallida. Biofumigation is another interesting area. That's a talk for another day. So trap crops were an alternative control option. I've worked with them, and myself and Matthew Back over in Jersey for many years, and we've been lucky that some of the local Shropshire growers have also grown with them. So very briefly then, these are the two that we looked at. So Solanum cimbria folium on the left-hand side, again, as James said about the real spikiness of it. They're not too bad actually until they start dying off, and then they really are significant. On the right-hand side, we've got Solanum scabrum, which is a newer version. I've only worked with it this year, even though it's been around a couple of years. It does have potential benefits in terms of, well, I say it's not got thorns on it, but it's also got a very broadly thick canopy, which is really helpful and may actually be much more beneficial in terms of a green cover crop. When you plant these crops, if you can get a good crop growing, and again, I will reiterate what James has said, you must treat these crops as crops. You can't just, the seed itself is relatively expensive, but for what it will actually save you in terms of other pest control measures, it's arguable, to be honest. But the actual population reduction is easily 70 to 80% if you can get a good crop growing. So the optimum sowing mid-May to early June or mid-June. And as James has already said, you know, end of June really is the latest they would want to see it growing at all. So our trial aims then is we want to know whether or not Cimbriifolium and scabrum can be grown effectively when sown late. So basically at the end of that period when it was recommended. So late in late June or very early July, or very late in late July. And the idea behind this is, could we get it to grow effectively after, you know, ideally it would be after a winter barley crop that's taken off. But even if you're looking at something like forage rye at the end of June, then that would be, you know, could we get this crop growing then? Because we really can't afford to have a loss of a crop in order to grow this one. The other aims then was, do Cim and scabrum need to be sown deeper than the recommended? And this is from work I'd already done myself when I was at Harper Adams. And I actually saw some benefit from planting it slightly deeper, only about 3 centimetres. But it was also in a way to look at, you know, for growers, when you actually plant this stuff, to say 0.5 to 1 centimetre planting depth, that's okay. But what happens if you do, if that drill does go deeper, if that seed bed is slightly softer and you end up putting it down, what does it actually, you know, what is the effect of that? And then does scabrum show growth potential in Shropshire and or Ormskirk? So some of our work was actually done up in Ormskirk in Lancashire. So we just wanted to see if we're getting that slightly a bit north, what was the effects? So we used a randomised 3 replicate trial, same with commercial equipment. The seed crop was mixed with lentils, as James already said. The seed rate itself then works out about 2 to 3 kilograms a hectare for the actual seed. Sowing dates late at the end of June and very late end of July, and we applied 50 kilograms of nitrogen within 2 weeks of planting. So this was our sowing equipment, standard Lemkin Solitaire. All of our 3 Shropshire sites were planted with this, and then in Ormskirk they used the Varderstadt Rapide. So very similar, in fact, they're disc coulters. And you can see on the Solitaire, we actually drilled into stubble as such, but obviously we've got a power harrow on the front of the Lemkin, which tickled it up nicely. Whereas with the Ormskirk, it was already pre-prepared and then the drill just came in over the top of it. And you have to think about the trial design in order to, how are you actually going to make this work? So you can see this is one of the ones at Cainton in Shropshire. So we had the front, we've actually got a pretty good layout of what we were doing. So 3 blocks, so 3 replicates. You can see the tractor in the background. You can see the other crops growing around it. So we have the July, the end of June, so like early July at this front section. And then we had late July into August. I was just right behind it. So we had the 2 crops right by side. So how did it actually look when we got going? Well, each individual trial, we had like an 8 to 10 metre run of the drill. And then between that, we had approximately a 4 metre gap so that we could actually do one drilling, step across into the next drilling, step across into the next block. Without, I mean, that tractor and drill combination is quite big, but we managed with a 4 metre gap between them to actually move it around quite effectively. So looking at this one, this is ground cover from the date 1 planting at Cainton. And we're doing this for a particular reason. The Cainton sites were without doubt the best sites. We had issues with some of the others that I'll talk about very shortly. So I'm going to focus on this one Cainton site. So in front of you at the moment, As we're looking on the left-hand side, you can see there are 4, well, just about to see there's 4 in there. So we have Cecimbrium sown at 3 centimetre depth, and then Scabrum sown at 1.5 centimetre, Cecimbria folium at 1.5, and Scabrum at 3 centimetres. And you can see the Scabrum is a little bit more patchy, especially where it was sown at 3 centimetres. So we certainly wouldn't be suggesting anybody sown it that deep, but we know for a fact, and we've got evidence to show what happens if you do over drill it deep. Behind that, then you've then got Cecimbria folium at 1.5 and Cecimbria folium at 3 centimetres, and again Scabrum at 3 and Scabrum at 1.5. Yes, there's a little bit of weed in there, but I would say that if you can get these crops growing, they actually are very competitive and will remove or prevent most of the weeds. On the very front section, and you can see on the Scabrum at 3 centimetres where it's really patchy, then you have got some weeds coming through. But the rest of this trial around this trial was sown with a commercial crop of Cecim, and it actually, it did do pretty well in terms of outcompeting most of the weeds. So if we then look at the progression, and this is one of the key things for me, is how do these crops grow? And you can see this again is at Cainton. We planted on the 25th of June. So all then at the bottom of the amount of days after planting. So we start looking on the left-hand side of the graph, and you can see by 43 days after planting, we'd only just about got 5% ground cover. And that was across the board on all of both species and both depths. And then it took some time, really. We were getting up to about 83 days after planting before we even got a 50% ground cover. Once we got up to about 115 days after planting, then our Cecim at 1.5 centimetres had got the most amount of ground cover, and that was at about 80%. But there's actually not a lot of difference to see between them. And these ground covers are done as a whole plot ground cover score, done from aerial imaging and some software that helps us to do that. One of the other key things that we can see from this, though, although it takes a very long time for this crop to grow, when it's planted at this time of year, I must emphasise that, we planted right on the edge of the timing for this particular crop. So we planted across there, but you can see then that both of the Cecim at 1.5 and 3 centimetres at the top, they maintain that ground cover right the way through till mid-December. And that was the last time I looked at it. It was still looking pretty good. For the Scabrum, it's a little bit more or a bit less frost tolerant. And so once we started getting into the middle of November, we started to lose the crop in terms of its ground cover, and then it disappeared down. So in some ways, it's actually much better than that. But we don't need to keep the crops going that long. But it does give you a bit of an idea is how well they will grow. Looking at the roots very quickly, on the left-hand side, we've got 4 plants from the Cecim, and on the right, we've got 4 plants from the Scabrum. This is 105 days after planting. We're suggesting that the Scabrum has got a slightly better root system. It looks more extensive, but we didn't actually plan that within the experimental work. There's only so much you can do with the amount of time and money that's available. But it gave us a bit of an idea of what was happening. But it does look like the Scabrum has other benefits. As we look then at the 7th of November, so now we're looking again at that Cainton site, 135 days after planting. And you can see that the Cecimbrifolium, the darker green, are substantially better for the majority of the plots than the Scabrum is. There's 1 or 2 Scabrums, well, like on the right-hand side, the second plot up from the bottom, that's actually doing not too bad. And I think that was because it was actually protected between 2 Cecimbrifolium ones. So overall, the conclusions that we had, and I mean, we did a significant amount of work, but there's only so much we can actually put in quite a short presentation. Planting in North Shropshire at the late, so the end of June timing, shows some potential on sandy loam soils, but the establishment is slow. And this was seen across all 3 sites, and the sites did have sandy loam soils, almost loamy sorry, loamy sands. And then we also have a medium soil, like a clay loam. And that actually did quite well to start with, but then it got wet. We had about 70 mil of rain in a day or a day and a half. And that really knocked it, because on that clay type soil that doesn't drain very well, this crop doesn't do it all well. We almost lost the trial. Weed control and excessive moisture then can be problematic. The very late planting in North Shropshire, unsuccessful. It did grow. We did get plants to grow, but not many. Although those that came through actually continued to grow, they were never what you would class as a crop. They were just individual plants that were within the plots that were growing. So definitely not a successful timing, and certainly wouldn't suggest anybody should try it. Planting at Ormskirk at either the late or the very late timing didn't appear to be viable. We had no crops at all come through. Individual plants came through, but there were some real issues with it. They were very, very slow to come through, and when they did come through, they didn't create a nice crop. However, I will say that within 2 days of both of the plantings at Ormskirk, we had significant amounts of rain. And that would have lowered the soil temperature considerably. And I think that was one of the key issues from the late timing that the crop had to deal with. And this crop does not like getting very, very wet during that emergence and establishment phase. So planting deeper than the recommended planting depth showed no benefit really at the late timing. It did show a little bit of benefit in the very late timing of the plants that came through. The ones planted deeper actually came through better. But since it's actually not going to be used as a drilling time, it's really not a very important finding. But we know that we don't need to grow to plant it deeper. But if you get it down to about 3 centimetres at the normal timing, the crop should still come through, but you really should be aiming for that 0.5 to 1 centimetre that is recommended by Produce Solutions. It's just if you do get a little bit deeper, the crop will come, but it'll be a lot slower. The scabrum shows good growth potential in North Shropshire, but it couldn't be established at Ormskirk at all. Again, just like the Sissim. It didn't like it, but again, same sort of problems because it was planted in a proper trial design. And it was unfortunate because if we hadn't had that rain so quickly after planting, I think we may have seen something slightly different. Hopefully we'll be able to try that this year. So in 2021, we are hoping to get some more money to have a look and to continue this work. We need to do a little bit more work on the establishment and the agronomy. But overall, I would say that for me, the key findings were once you get into that end of June timing, you are going to struggle to get a crop to really grow and grow through and do what we needed to do. We didn't do any PCN sampling, or not very much. We did a little bit, but it's quite an expensive thing to be doing. And that's the other thing we'll be focusing on this year. But for many years, I've worked with Sissim, and I know it will actually produce some really good results. It's just trying to find that nice slot for it to go into, to be honest. So acknowledgements. I would like to thank Anne Stone from the AHDB and Andrew Wade from Optigrow, who were the coordinators of this particular set of trials. Matthew Back from Harper Adams University. He's obviously got extensive nematology knowledge. The farmers themselves, Andrew Webster from Ormskirk, Neil Furness, Robert Belcher, Tim and Nick Belcher from Shropshire, North Shropshire, who basically gave the time and the land to actually, see how this crop grows. And I think they all realise that it's really important that if you can get trials work on your own land, then the results can really, really mean something to you. The work was sponsored by the Innovative Farmers from the Soil Association, so through Rebecca Swin. And obviously we need to thank Produce Solutions for supplying the seed, because it is quite difficult to get hold of. And we did need to make sure we had good certified seed that we could trust. Now, as a final slide, really, sorry, going backwards, this gives you, this will be there for you to see later. I'm not going to talk much about it. Gives you an idea of the temperature ranges, both air and 10 centimetre soil temperature. So when James was talking about that 15 degrees, you could follow that across really and see that, that first planting at Cainton, it was going into soil that was almost 20 degrees. And that was the crop really that did really, really well. As you look across the others then, as you get into the later planting, which was the end of July, we were struggling really, an average temperature of about 16 degrees. So, keeping away from that end of the season, I think, is an absolute must. Anyway, thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be quite happy to take them. Thank you, Anne.
Right, thank you both. We've got a case here where our two presenters each have a huge wealth of knowledge about the topic. And any of you who are thinking of putting in trap crops this year would have the opportunity to look again at these presentations. They'll be available for at least a few weeks. And also to contact the presenters. It's not only James Lee at Produce Solutions. If he's too busy, Richard Griffiths, his colleague, has been working on this topic for years and can give further advice. And this, and also the full report of the Innovative Farmers Trap Crop project can be found on the AHDB website. And it is worth going into the detail if you're doing a trap cropping for the first time. Now, James made the point that these are a crop and needed to be treated like a crop. And that links us to an interesting question from Martin Cox, because when any wild plant becomes a crop, its huge genetic diversity in the wild tends to be slimmed down drastically. Now, Martin says that with black nightshade, different strains or subspecies can have quite different effects on PCN. So this could be the same situation with broadleaf or with Cicimbrifolium. James, how do you know that what the seed you're providing is uniform and all of the same quality?
Well, it's a good point that Martin raises, and I suppose the way to address it is that we are and have been for a number of years aware of the potential for off types, and it's always something that we're looking to make sure doesn't happen. We do occasionally see off types. Sometimes you can see, and in fact, with the trial at Cainton, we saw the odd Cicimbrifolium plant that had a slightly different coloured flower to the rest of them. But we certainly set out with the best of intentions to make sure that the seed that we have grown is all uniform, because we're aware of the issue for off types. So yeah, it could be a potential concern. Yes, have we measured the extent to which off types might display different characteristics as trap crops? We haven't, because we haven't really seen a massive fluctuation in the crops that are grown, or to put it another way, we haven't seen a massive amount of off types. So it's not really been an area that we've looked at extensively.
Right, thanks, James. Then there were a number of questions about free-living nematodes, with the comment that with loss of vidate, what a pity trap crops can't deal with those as well. I think that's asking rather a lot of trap crops to expect them to do the same as a chemical.
Yeah, well, they don't control late blight either. That would be great. I mean, there's a limitation.
Yeah, I think if we can get pallida under control, that'll be a huge step forward. But all these questions people have asked about free-living nematodes, think shows that we ought to provide a webinar on another occasion about that topic. In the meantime, I could recommend anyone interested in that to the website Best for Soils, which gives a massive information on what free-living nematodes are hosted by which crops. But to continue on trap crops, there's a question from Alex Wade here. How would you compare their efficacy with a good biofumigation crop? And when would you choose one over the other? And perhaps we could start here with Ivan.
Yeah, good question. Generally, we would say the efficacy of biofumigation crops is less in terms of the PCN control. We know that it is quite variable. There's some really good work being done through Matthew Back, obviously through Harper and the group there. 40 to 65% is not unknown with the biofumigation crop. The problem, I think, I would say, is they are very often sold as a mix of species. And so comparing one mix with another mix is actually quite difficult. So it's like if we compare Sissim and we compare Sissim with Sissim at another site and again at another site, we're still comparing results of Sissim folding. Whereas when you're looking at biofumigation, you could be looking at one particular type of biofumigation mix compared to another. So I think to start with, we've got an issue about how do we make that comparison. Biofumigation have a really good place to play in PCN control. They also have a really good place to play, in fact, because of the green manure effects and the benefits to the soils. And if you talk to growers that have been using it for a couple of years, the benefit to soil organic matter is significant from using biofumigation crops. Where would you choose to use one over another? Well, I think at the moment, we know that you can plant a biofumigation crop, as soon as your barley is off the ground, and you will still get a really good biofumigation crop. So you'll get some benefit from it. Whereas we know we've still got this issue with the trap crop of we really need it to be planted, at the end of May, beginning of June at the latest. And I think that is one of the key issues, is if you've got that timing, if you've got that slot to be able to get the Sissim or the Scabrum in around about the end of May timing, then that would be my choice absolutely every single time. I have seen very little work on biofumigation where they are getting up to 90% kill of PCN. And that's a significant effect, 90%. We have seen some. I'm not saying there isn't any out there. I've seen some work, I think it was done in Leeds, where they'd used biofumigation and actually found some really good kill. But it was glasshouse work from memory as opposed to field work. And I've worked with Sissim for many years, and I have always been an advocate of it. I think it has got, when we first started to use it, I started to come across it was when we were in set-aside, using set-aside. And that was an absolutely perfect thing for Sissim, because set-aside, you could plant it in, because it was a non-food crop. There was no argument about it. It wasn't used for anything other than what it was used for. So you could plant it. And we saw some fantastic crops being grown. So we know that it can grow really well, and we know it can do a really good job on PCN. So for me, my choice is if I got that slot, I would be putting Sissim or Scabrum in. I haven't obviously had very much experience with Scabrum, but what we're seeing in terms of the results from that as well is, as good, if not better than, and possibly other benefits from it as well. So I think we've got a really good opportunity to move forward if we've got the right time to plant.
And James, can you add anything to that on the two techniques?
No, not really. I think Ivan said it very well. I don't think that Ivan said exactly the same as what I would have said. I mean, in summary, a well-established crop, trap crop, will outperform a well-established biofumigation crop, but a poorly established trap crop will probably only perform the same as a biofumigant, or potentially not as well as a good biofumigant. Yeah,
so everything depends on growing these crops with attention to detail and putting the effort in, which is hard, of course, when you have cash crops at the same time. And this leads on to a question by Simon Faulkner about depth of planting and soil moisture. And in dry conditions, should the seed be slightly deeper drilled? That was what you concentrated on, Ivan, in your work. Would you agree?
Yeah. I think what we've shown is that you need to get it in the ground, and I think the key bit is the consolidation of the seed, and I think that is absolutely paramount. Many years ago, we did come across growers which are basically, again, it's when they don't treat it as a crop and they just sort of like try and get it in the ground as cheaply as possible. Don't really pay a lot of attention to the depth. You need to get it in the ground, let's say 0.5 to 1 centimeters, and once it's in there and consolidate it, then you get that soil to seed contact and it will grow quite happily. I wouldn't really be worrying too much about trying to push it deeper into the soil moisture. If you think about the natural way this crop grows, the seed basically falls off the plant and lands on the soil surface. So naturally, it would actually quite happily grow. But there is some interesting information around when you look at whether or not it light stimulates it or actually inhibits the seed. And the research is, it's arguable between the two. Some actually say you need to get it covered and so it doesn't see sunlight, and some research says you don't need to get it covered and sunlight won't affect it at all. But in terms of soil moisture, all seed will need, sorry.
I wonder if we could pass to James on that, because he's had years of trying different seed depths in different conditions.
Well, again, I'd agree with what Ivan says. I mean, from the work that we've done, it's the seed to soil contact that's key. In some situations, it might be that if the soil is extremely dry, then soil moisture at depth might have an influence. It was interesting talking to Ivan about the trials that we did late season planting, and Ivan indicated that some of the deeper plantings resulted in better establishment at the very, very late sowing dates, and I think Ivan was thinking that was probably related to soil temperature, and the soil temperature being higher 3 centimeters down rather than 1 centimeter depth, because of the impact of the early frosts and early cold from that perspective. But key to it is getting good seed to soil contact in a moist seedbed.
Right, and then could I add something to that about how important is irrigation? I don't know, over the years, have many of your customers, James, used irrigation, and if so, has that helped?
Yes, it has, and it's something we recommend at the moment in the agronomy guidelines, that if the seedbed isn't moist, and then certainly if we don't see rain for a few days after drilling and there's none in the forecast, then we would recommend irrigation. But again, as Ivan indicated from some of the trials last autumn at Ormskirk, is that you can get it too far the other way, and we don't want it. We don't want to drown the seedbed. We just want to make sure that it's moist, so that the seed will germinate in the same way as most seed requires moisture to germinate.
Thanks. I think you had another point to make, Ivan.
Yeah, I suppose only in terms of, I mean, I grew system over in Jersey, and we always irrigated it over there just to make sure we actually had some nice soil moisture. But I absolutely, stand by what James is saying. Just be really careful. I mean, our climate is so unpredictable; it's really difficult. And if you then go in with a blanket irrigation to say, okay, I'm going to make sure the soil is moist, and then 2 days later it puts down another 25 to 50 mil of water, you're going to lose the crop. So you really need to be a bit careful about your forecast. Can you be certain of it? But we always used it in Jersey. This year we didn't use it. I should say last year we didn't use it at Cainton, in fact, any of the sites at all. But we had a traditional high-class, traditional summer for the UK. So we had plenty of moisture anyway. But I still think it's that consolidation that is really, really important.
Right. Now, a rather different topic. In terms of place within rotation, David Steele asks, is it best the year immediately before spuds, or would any year be suitable? Perhaps, James, you could tackle that first.
I don't think it matters greatly, although one of the things I mentioned was that in an ideal situation, we would suggest, if you're going to establish it after a potato crop, that it's probably best to leave it a few months for the PCN cysts to mature. Having said that, I'm aware that in Jersey they grow it immediately after a potato crop, and they see really good results. So, we were basing our advice more from a speculative point of view than any particular research that we'd done on it, on the basis that if you've got a 6 or 7 year rotation in which to choose to place a trap crop, then don't plump for immediately after a potato crop. But they do in Jersey, and they do it very successfully.
Yes. Well, in the Innovative Farmers trial, we had one of the hosts growing after a whole crop, which meant that he was able to get the trap crop in late June. So there it was not the place in the rotation in relation to potatoes that mattered. It was his opportunity to take 2 crops in one season, which determined his choice. Ivan, is there anything you could add about where in the rotation?
Yes, I think looking from a nematology point of view, although they do it in Jersey, and we do tend to be working with some significant PCN numbers over there because of the way they grow the crops. We know that immediately after a crop of potatoes, then a lot of the cysts will go into dormancy anyway. So, I would say from my own personal experience, I would want to leave it at least a couple of years after that potato crop. And then from then onwards, it doesn't really matter. Once you know that all the cysts or the majority of the nematodes are able to be stimulated, then 2 or 3 or say 2 years after the potato crop gives you a great potential to reduce that PCN population down. If you've got 50 eggs per gram of soil, you'll have only had a couple of years of loss, to the natural decline. But all of the nematodes within the soil, all the PCN, will be ready to be stimulated and released. So, we could be seeing going from 50 eggs per gram of soil down to 80% off that. So we could be looking at only 5, 6, say 10 eggs per gram left. Which then, if you're in year 2 of that and you've got another 3 or 4 years of natural decline at 5 or 10% decline, you could see it actually declining significantly before you plant the potato crop. If you plant it before the potato crop, though, simply because you can leave it to grow for a little bit longer, and that is the benefit when you actually proceed in potatoes themselves, then as long as you've got the time to do it, it will still work really well. Because again, if you started off with 50 or 100 eggs per gram at the end of the potato crop, over those 5 or 6 years before your next potato crop, you will have a significant natural decline anyway. So your trap crop is then dealing with a smaller population, and the effect will still be 80-85% decline anyway. So, I think, as James said, fit it in where you can fit it in. My own preference would not be straight after a potato crop. I would be anything after the second, simply because of the diapause, if you like, that the nematodes go into. But other than that, I don't think it matters.
That's nice and clear. Now, Simon Taylor asks, with Cicimbrifolium, could you top it partway through the season for a second flush and possibly stimulation of root exudates? Do either of you have experience to be able to answer that question?
No, it's not something that we've even considered. I don't even know whether Cicim would regrow if you topped it, nor would it potentially release any more exudates. I mean, what we do know is that, as I mentioned, Cicim and Scabrum don't need to be in the ground for particularly prolonged periods of time for them to achieve the desired result, which is hatch of PCN eggs, but no multiplication through formation of cysts.
Right, so that wouldn't be necessary. Oh, good. Now, a legal question here from Martin Cox is, what's the position regarding national list? And are we allowed to grow a species from abroad which hasn't gone through national list testing?
Yeah, not a good question for Martin. It's something we established. So Ivan mentioned that way back when, for those of us old enough to remember set aside was around when we first developed the concept of using Solanum cicimbrifolium for trap cropping, and so we had to engage in conversations with DEFRA at that time to establish permission from DEFRA to use Solanum cicimbrifolium on set aside, and so we established the acceptance from DEFRA for us to go ahead and do that at that point, specifically around the area of set aside. But I say, unfortunately, as I've indicated, we haven't got set aside to establish those crops anymore.
Ah, you never know. Perhaps Elms will give us another opportunity.
No.
Right. Well, we've come to the end of our questions now. And I must thank both our presenters for their enthusiasm to grapple with this difficult subject. And it can offer a way of reducing PCN, which so damages the potential of land for potato growing. And trap crops in conjunction with other methods could allow us to bring back land into potato production, which at the moment is just not suited for it. Now, in terms of our Spot Results Week, the next topic will be from 3 to 4:30 today on weed control with fewer actives. And you can now see the basis code. Please record that in order to be able to claim your points. Thank you.